course of what I called in the title of the talk an unprecedented surge in firearm purchasing across the US, which is a very real and quantifiable fact in terms of just how many people are purchasing relative to what we would have expected in any given year. And I'm highlighting that because, as you said, emerging data is telling us some pretty concerning stories. And so the story leading up to this surge and the story sort of historically in this country, it is a set of pretty steady facts. We know that, a firearm in a home increases the likelihood of suicide death for everybody in that home by 3 to 5 times, right? So compared to homes without them, it goes up. And that's even more extreme if the firearm stored unsafely. So, firearm stored loaded, it's stored, in your bedside table, ready access, as opposed to a gun safe or a lockbox. So we know that's true. And those are startling facts and concerning facts. But one of the things that's always made me feel a little bit better is that firearm ownership and access, generally speaking, isn't associated with thoughts of suicide. So purchasing a firearm doesn't make someone suicidal. The fact that there's a firearm in your home doesn't make it more likely you're going to think about or want to die by suicide, which is excellent, right? It can shape your thoughts a little bit, right? So if you are suicidal, it might make you think about firearm suicide as opposed to some other method, but it doesn't prompt the beginning of that process. So generally speaking, if I've got a firearm owner or a non-firearm owner, neither person's more likely than the other on average to be thinking about suicide. And that keeps people safe. Because when you are suicidal, when you have ready access to a firearm, the risk that you're going to die goes up dramatically, if for no other reason than firearms are just so much more lethal than any other method for the most part. We're talking 85 to 95% of all firearm suicide attempts result in death. And we're talking less than 5% of all other attempts combined result in death, right? So it's just a fundamental discrepancy. And so obviously it's not that firearm suicide is more important or more tragic than any other method. It isn't. No matter what method someone uses, the endpoint is tragic. But the fact is this particular endpoint facilitates things. But here's what that emerging data and that purchasing surge changes the story a little bit. It makes me more concerned and why I'm centering my talk on that sort of point in time. And so when I say unprecedented surge, we don't have a national registry, right? So we don't know exactly how many firearms people are purchasing nationwide anyway. And so one of the things people use are things like NICS background checks, that National Instant Criminal Background Check system that most legal firearm purchases go through. That's not an actual measure of how many firearms are purchased, but it's a loose measure of how many times people tried to buy them, right? So you can compare that to another year and be like, well, how frequently are people doing this, and kind of get a read on it. And so using that, people say, well, we're like 40 to 60% higher from one year to the next. And every year is higher than the other population growth. So a 40 to 60% jump from one year to the next. It's not like the previous year was a low year. And so it's rebounding. It's an unprecedented surge. But you can even get more detail on states that do track this. So unlike Mississippi, where I lived for the better part of the last decade, where there's really no tracking at all. It's a very low amount of legislation that's involved in regulating access or tracking access to firearms. In New Jersey, there's a lot, including permits to purchase, and purchasing permit requests went up over 300% in 2020 relative to 2019 in New Jersey. So this is happening not just in red states or blue states or southwestern states or northeastern states. It's happening in all states, some more than others. So states where you have a deeper gun culture and more easy ability to purchase, you're going to see that surge go up more, just because it's more part of life and there's fewer obstacles, but you're seeing it all over the place. So what that tells us is that there's just millions and millions of more firearms that have come into homes than we would have expected. Do you know exactly why that's happening? No. Based on the timing of it, some of it is undoubtedly tied to stress related to COVID and folks worried about society breaking down and not having access to stuff. Some of it is likely related to the racial justice movement. You're seeing a much bigger surge in firearm purchasing amongst Black Americans than you have typically seen. But you will also see a good number of folks who are white and feel threatened by racial justice movements and are trying to maintain some position of privilege and power, who are purchasing in response to a feeling of threat. But you also see surges anytime there's an upcoming presidential election where there might be a Democratic president coming in place of a Republican one. There's always a surge. And then if there's some pandemic and a supply chain concern, well, people are going to purchase to make sure they don't lose the opportunity in the future. So there's all sorts of reasons going in. Not everybody's buying a firearm for the same reason. And the surge doesn't come down to one thing. It comes down to all sorts of things. And I think the reality is for all of us, 2020 wasn't just one thing. 2020 was all the things at the same time, right? And so people were stressed and they bought a lot of firearms. What the data tells us, it's scary. And what's different than everything I said up till now, and this is a paper we published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, I want to say maybe 2 months ago now. It's hard to keep track of time these days. But what we found was that folks who purchased firearms during that surge, this still ongoing surge, but we had collected this data last summer, so June, July, the first real handful of months of the pandemic, really in the thick of the social justice movement is rising, not quite at the presidential election yet, but it's obviously in the news every day. So really in the thick of it, the folks who purchased during that surge were far more likely than other gun owners or non-firearm owners to have had lifetime suicidal thoughts, to have had past year suicidal thoughts, to have past month suicidal thoughts. So these folks are more likely than anyone else to have thought about suicide in their lifetime, and in fact, to have thought about suicide recently. And like I said before, that is different. That means, unlike other cohorts of firearm owners, unlike what we see year to year to year, when we already see firearms accounting for more than half of our suicide deaths, in this case, firearms are coming in at a much greater rate amongst folks who are in a crisis or recently were, to the extent that they were thinking about suicide. So that is alarming. And that's why I'm centering this AAS talk in that area, because it's not that everything is different now, but that we might need to be focusing specifically on what's going on now, what's been going on in the past year, and what we expect to go on in the coming year, and think about the possibility that it's a different level of risk. And we need to have potentially different solutions implemented in different places if we're going to keep this from being a problem that results in an even more elevated level of tragedies than we already see.